Nintendo used to be good is kind of the rallying cry for a lot of anti-Nintendo sentiments in 2025, especially over the past decade. It seems like that was the big rallying cry for, the anti-Wii sentiment and the idea that Nintendo games were like declining in quality, or that Nintendo wasn't being innovative or creative enough with the actual video games. So many people like rallied around this mindset, this idea that like Nintendo games were getting worse. And one of the go-to copes they would use would be to point towards a game, that's iconic, that they produced, that's considered the greatest of all time, and use that as kind of a bludgeon against like Nintendo's more recent offerings. And I don't think there is a better example than Super Mario Bros. 3. Over the past several decades, Mario 3 has been put on a pedestal, essentially. Not only is it considered one of the greatest Nintendo games of all time, one of the greatest NES games, one of the greatest Mario games, the idea is that like the game is so overwhelmingly like fantastic, that nothing else can even compete with it. And for, the first like, 15 years after release, that was true. Mario 3 like stood the test of time. It's still relevant today. It's still iconic, like there's so much you can say about Mario 3 that, kind of really set the standard for 2D platforming games, for uh, really prove the longevity of the Mario brand, really prove the relevancy of 2D platformers. Mario 3 was, a major milestone video game at the time. And I do think that really needs to be emphasized, going into this, right, at the time, because, obviously Mario 3 is a great game. Obviously the NES was a great console. Obviously Nintendo is a great developer. But the thing I have an issue with, and I do think this is like something that really needs to be said, is that Mario 3 has been topped a long time ago. The reality is the Mario brand has always been growing and evolving. Mario 3 evolved, Mario World evolved the formula in several like notable aspects, including like incorporating more colors, a more well versed, interesting world. Characters like Yoshi, having more dynamic mechanics and abilities, having secrets, an improved map screen, right? There's so much about Mario World that's like a clear, blatant improvement over 3, right? But I have known several people over my lifetime who will like insist that 3 is some like major milestone, like gaming, a cultural, like untouchable, just, landmark, while Mario World was the beginning of the decline of the brand. And that attitude has kind of persisted into the modern day, because I know plenty of people who will downplay, all of the follow ups, whether it's Yoshi's Island, the Super Mario Land games, the Mario 64, Sunshine, Odyssey, Galaxy. Like, I have seen so many people try and come out and speak out about Mario 3 and just how much better it is than anything else Nintendo has ever produced. And I've come to realize over the past 15 years or so, as I've played Mario 3 and especially as I've played like other Mario games, just how untrue this actually is. Because Mario 3, people really do kind of understate like how it has aged. I think one of the big major things for me personally is just how short the levels are. How typically like you have like one gimmick that's thrown at you once, and then you just kind of move past it and like beat the stage and move on, right? Like the stages do feel way, way, way too short. Like the music on the NES game feels kind of chipped and not as good memorable as the original or Mario 2. Uh, there's that weird like there's a dip in quality in the levels near the end. Yeah, I'd say 7 and 8 aren't as good as the rest of the game. So you have these real problems with Mario 3, right? things that people don't really address or talk about or try to ignore or try to understate, while when it comes to like other Nintendo games, like the criticisms towards them are so out there and ridiculous that you can't even really take them seriously or respect them at all, right? When it comes to like Mario games in particular, there's this mindset that like they've lost their creative spark if they don't innovate, if they don't do anything, especially when it comes to the 2D games. When it comes to like 2D versus 3D Mario, there's this mindset like, well, I only play 2D Mario, I only like 2D Mario, like 3D Mario, 3D ruined Mario. Like there are people who will like religiously swear by that, and yet at the same time these people also are very critical of games like New Super Mario Bros. Right? That's one of my things. Looking at Mario 3. If you're such a big fan of Super Mario Bros. 3, what it contributed to gaming, its legacy, the characters, the world, the setting. Why have you not graduated to the follow-ups? Why have you not like learned to appreciate Mario World? Why have you not learned to appreciate, games like Donkey Kong Country or Yoshi's Island or Wario Land or what have you? And especially, why have you not come to understand that there is value in the subsequent Mario games? The 3D Mario games are now iconic classics in their own right. Mario 64 revolutionized like 3D gaming with its unique control scheme and like how it evolved the formula. You have like a games like Galaxy, which are like the finest obstacle 3D platformers ever produced. And then you have Odyssey, which is like this huge, like creative, like extravaganza, like really showcasing like how much the world and like the Mario brand has grown over the decades, right? You have all of these great games, and then you have the 2D Mario games. New Super Mario Bros. In a lot of ways is better than Super Mario Bros. 3. This isn't something that like people like acknowledging or or admitting to because it flies in the face of the narrative. Because, the narrative has always been that like New Super Mario Bros. Is stale, derivative, uninspired, that it doesn't do anything fresh, new, original, or exciting. But if you actually play the games, you find a lot of things that were not present in the original Super Mario Bros. 3. Like, things like pipe cannons, the Giga Mushroom, like, local multiplayer, right? New Super Mario Bros. Like really raised the bar when it came to that kind of thing. And Super Mario Bros. Wonder not only like improved on those aspects, but kind of just gave it its own unique identity. Like I do think it's very telling, like how the go-to cope regarding like New Super Mario Bros. Throughout like its entire like golden age period, like its relevancy period, like the entire cope for that entire span of time was this idea that the visuals were outdated, the games didn't look good, right? They were rehashed, they were uninspired, and yet somehow people retroactively like outfitted these complaints to the original New Super Mario Bros. And New Super Mario Bros. Wii as well. Like these were complaints that came about because of like New Super Mario Bros. 2 and U, which also did not really relate much to those games. But when you look at like New Super Mario Bros. Specifically, at the time we hadn't had a new 2D Mario game in like 15 years. So like this idea that this game was somehow rehashed or uninspired or derivative was 100% not true, like at all. And that's like pretty observable by just seeing just how well received the game was at the time. Like the idea that like the game was derivative and uninspired was retroactively outfitted, and by acting as if like Mario 3 was just so much better. And that's kind of the trend we've been seeing like every time a new Mario game comes out when it comes to these boomers, every single time all they do, they don't play the game, they don't know anything about the game, they don't They don't understand Mario. They don't understand like how the audience has grown and evolved. They don't understand like how Nintendo has grown and evolved. All they do in order to downplay whatever Nintendo is doing now, whether it's ARMS or Dragon Drive or, Pokemon even, like the entire giant cope has always been to sit there and try and convince people that Mario 3 was better than this. And obviously Mario 3 has like a place in history. Obviously its place can't be eclipsed, when it comes to like its role as like the NES's like magnum opus in certain ways. There's plenty of nice things you can say about Mario 3, but like conversely, you do have to understand that gaming has evolved far past this game. And that's my big takeaway, looking at like the constant never-ending like criticisms of modern Mario games, of games like Donkey Kong Bonanza. So many people like want to try and write off these games for petty, like just uninspired reasons. But the reality of it all is that Mario 3 isn't going to be this game that people obsess over forever. In fact, I almost feel like now this is a game that's kind of already been left in the past. Like we do kind of have to move past this mindset that like Nintendo will never ever top Mario 3. Like even when like Sonic the Hedgehog came out, there was this mindset that like, oh, Nintendo, they can't innovate or grow their brand at all. That's why Sonic is so huge. That's why Sonic is so popular. That was like the actual explanation given by game journals. And yet, Sonic very quickly fell off and became completely irrelevant while Nintendo continued to flourish and keep introducing new games, not only in the Mario IP, but when it comes to their like wider catalog in general. I do think this is the major takeaway when it comes to this is that the NES boomers are are just completely out of touch with modern Nintendo. They really genuinely want to believe that the games they grew up with is the absolute peak of the company, and they never want to play anything new. They never want to like experience anything else that Nintendo has to offer. They'll make whatever petty excuse they can possibly make to downplay Dread or Breath of the Wild or what have you. I've seen people do this, and they just can't bring themselves to admit that they just aren't hardcore gamers. They don't actually have any interest in expanding past their narrow-minded assumption that Mario 3 will never ever ever be topped. It is just a lazy, broken, uninspired way of viewing video games. Like the idea that the game you grew up with is better than anything that came before or after.